Dad never loved you anyway, my daughter-in-law said with a laugh during the reading of my husband's will, and my son just sat there staring at the polished oak table like he hadn't heard a thing. The attorney's office suddenly felt too small for the amount of humiliation pressing against my chest. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows behind us, and somewhere in the hallway, I could hear the faint buzz of a copy machine. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary people going about their ordinary Tuesday morning while my entire life quietly collapsed in front of me. I folded my black gloves carefully in my lap and looked at Nicole for a long moment. At 39, she had perfected the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. Sharp, controlled, beautiful in the way expensive department store mannequins are beautiful. Empty underneath. Nicole, the attorney said cautiously, adjusting his glasses, this is a formal legal proceeding. Oh, come on, she replied with a soft laugh, brushing imaginary lint from the sleeve of her cream-colored coat. We all know Thomas worshipped Ryan. Evelyn was just there. Ryan still didn't look at me. My son was 43 years old, broad-shouldered like his father, with the same dark hair that had only recently started turning gray around the temples. When he was little, he used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms because he was afraid of lightning. I used to hold him against my chest until he fell asleep. Now he couldn't even meet my eyes while his wife erased me from my own marriage. The attorney cleared his throat and continued reading. My husband had been dead for 8 days. 8 days since I stood beside a gray marble casket under cold November skies, while people brought casseroles to my house and spoke to me in soft voices filled with pity. 8 days since I came home from the funeral and instinctively reached for the second coffee mug the next morning before remembering there was no one left to drink from it. 38 years of marriage reduced to a stack of papers inside a leather folder. The property located on Willow Creek Drive shall transfer to Ryan Carter. The attorney read carefully. Nicole's lips curved slightly. I recognized that look. Victory restrained just enough to remain socially acceptable. My fingers tightened around my gloves. Willow Creek Drive. Our house. The white colonial with the wraparound porch Thomas and I bought when Ryan was 6 years old. The house where I painted nursery walls by hand. The house where Thomas planted roses for me every spring because he said the yard deserved something prettier than grass. The house where I sat beside my husband's hospital bed in the living room during his final weeks listening to the grandfather clock tick through endless sleepless nights. Additionally, the attorney continued, certain investment accounts and retirement assets will also transfer directly to Ryan Carter. Nicole leaned back comfortably in her chair now. Relaxed, confident, like someone who had already redecorated the house in her mind. I noticed the way her engagement ring caught the overhead lighting when she crossed her arms. A large diamond Thomas once quietly told me looked unnecessarily flashy. The memory almost made me smile. Almost. And for my wife, Evelyn Carter, the attorney paused. Something shifted slightly in the room. Ryan finally looked up. I felt my heartbeat slow instead of quicken. Strange how shock can become calm once it grows too heavy to carry. Thomas Carter requests that Evelyn Carter retain full residential access to the Willow Creek property for the duration of her natural life. Nicole's expression hardened instantly. Excuse me, she said sharply. The attorney continued reading before she could interrupt again. No permanent sale, refinancing, structural modification, or occupancy change may occur without written consent from Evelyn Carter. Silence. Thick and immediate. Nicole sat forward slowly. That makes no sense, she said. Ryan owns the house. Co-ownership restrictions are outlined here. The attorney replied carefully. Mrs. Carter maintains protected residency rights under the estate trust. Nicole let out a short laugh that sounded nothing like amusement anymore. Protected residency? She repeated. So she just plans to stay there forever? She finally looked directly at me then, and the kindness disappeared completely from her face. Honestly, Evelyn, don't you think it's time to stop pretending Thomas loved you like he used to? Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside her. Not defending me, not stopping her, just uncomfortable, as though my humiliation was becoming socially inconvenient for him. I looked down at my wedding ring. 38 years. I remembered Thomas slipping it onto my finger in a tiny church outside Albany while snow fell so heavily we thought nobody would make it to the ceremony. He kissed my forehead afterward because he knew I was nervous. You and me, he whispered back then. Always. The attorney quietly organized his papers while avoiding eye contact with all of us. Nicole exhaled impatiently. "Well," she said, smoothing her coat again, "at least now we can finally move forward." Move forward. Such a harmless phrase. People use it after funerals, after illnesses, after disasters. But sitting there in that cold office, listening to my daughter-in-law discuss my future like I was an inconvenient piece of furniture left behind after a remodel, I realized something quietly devastating. Thomas's death was not the moment I lost my family. That had happened long before the funeral. I just hadn't seen it until now. The house sounded different after Thomas died. Not quieter exactly, just hollow in a way I could feel in my bones. Every room carried the strange stillness that settles over a home after years of routine suddenly disappear. The grandfather clock in the hallway sounded louder now. The refrigerator motor hummed longer than I remembered. Even the hardwood floors creaked differently beneath my slippers, as if the house itself understood something irreversible had happened there. I woke up every morning at 6:15 out of habit because that was when Thomas always liked his coffee. For 38 years, I brewed the same dark roast blend and poured his cup first before opening the kitchen curtains overlooking the backyard. On the 9th morning after the funeral, I still reached automatically for his favorite navy blue mug before stopping myself halfway across the counter. My hand remained suspended in the air for several seconds. Then I quietly placed the mug back into the cabinet. Untouched. Ryan and Nicole had moved into the house temporarily during Thomas's illness 6 months earlier. At first, I appreciated the company. The doctors had warned us that congestive heart failure could become unpredictable near the end, and Ryan insisted I should not handle everything alone. I believed him. Looking back now, I wondered when concern quietly turned into ownership. Nicole began changing small things almost immediately after they arrived. New throw pillows appeared in the living room. Framed family photographs disappeared from shelves and were replaced with minimalist decorations from expensive home boutiques. One afternoon, I came downstairs and found our wedding portrait missing from the fireplace mantel entirely. I thought the room needed something cleaner. Nicole explained casually while arranging white ceramic vases where 38 years of marriage used to stand. Cleaner. I remember staring at those empty shelves, feeling something cold settle deep inside my chest. Thomas noticed it too. I could tell by the way his eyes lingered silently on the missing photograph during dinner that night. But he said nothing. Near the end, he rarely argued with anyone anymore. Exhaustion had softened him into silence. 3 days after the funeral, I discovered the code to Thomas's home office had been changed. I stood in the hallway pressing the familiar numbers twice before the keypad flashed red. Nicole appeared behind me carrying a basket of folded laundry. "Oh," she said lightly. "Ryan updated the security settings yesterday. We are trying to organize things a little better." Organize things. Another harmless phrase that somehow felt cruel. "Thomas never locked this room," I replied quietly. "Well, there are important documents in there now," she answered with a polite smile. "It is probably safer this way." Safer for whom? I almost asked, but I already knew the answer. That evening, I sat alone in the breakfast nook watching rain slide slowly down the kitchen windows while Ryan spoke softly with Nicole in the next room. Their voices blurred together beneath the low sound of the television. Then I heard my name. I was not trying to listen. Grief sharpens your hearing whether you want it to or not. "She cannot stay here forever," Nicole whispered. "Ryan, we have already talked about this." A long silence followed. Then my son sighed heavily. "Just give it time." "Time for what?" Nicole snapped quietly. "Your father is gone now. Everything changes." I stared down at the untouched bowl of soup cooling in front of me. Everything changes. The words settled over the room like dust. I suddenly realized nobody had asked me what I wanted. Not once since Thomas died. People brought flowers. They brought sympathy cards and baked macaroni casseroles wrapped in foil. They hugged me gently near the church entrance after the funeral service. But nobody asked where I planned to live. Nobody asked how I felt sleeping alone in a king-sized bed after nearly 4 decades beside the same man. Nobody asked whether I was afraid. The next morning, I walked into the garage and found Thomas's workbench partially cleared out. His fishing gear was gone. The old tackle box he kept beside the tool cabinet had disappeared along with his winter coats. Ryan was standing near the shelves holding a cardboard box filled with extension cords and power tools. I figured I would start organizing Dad's things. he said without looking directly at me. Dad's things. Not our things. I nodded slowly because grief had made me too tired to fight over objects. But later that night, I opened the hallway closet and pressed my face quietly against one of Thomas's old flannel jackets that Ryan had overlooked. It still smelled faintly like cedarwood aftershave and cold autumn air. I stood there in silence for nearly 10 minutes, holding on to fabric like it was proof that my life had actually happened. Then downstairs, I heard Nicole laughing softly while discussing renovation ideas for the kitchen. The strange thing about betrayal is that it rarely arrives all at once. Looking back, I realized it had been quietly unfolding around me for months while I was too busy worrying about Thomas to notice. After his diagnosis, my entire world narrowed to medication schedules, doctor appointments, sodium restrictions, and the soft rise and fall of his breathing at night. I stopped paying attention to the small shifts happening inside my own home. Nicole noticed everything, though. She always noticed opportunities. About 4 months before Thomas passed away, she suddenly developed a deep interest in family finances. At first, it seemed harmless enough. She offered to organize medical bills. She volunteered to help Ryan sort through insurance paperwork. She even brought color-coded folders into the dining room one Saturday afternoon and spread documents neatly across the table like some efficient corporate assistant. "I just want to reduce stress for everyone," she said with that calm, polished smile of hers. Thomas looked exhausted that day. His skin had already taken on the pale gray tone that frightened me every time I noticed it under certain lighting. He sat quietly at the head of the table flipping through statements while Nicole explained investment summaries in a cheerful voice that sounded strangely out of place beside hospice pamphlets and prescription receipts. "We should probably simplify ownership structures too," she said casually while tapping her pen against one of the folders. "Things can get complicated later if nobody prepares ahead of time." I remember feeling uncomfortable hearing the word later spoken so casually while my husband was still alive and sitting right there beside us. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair. "There is time for that," he replied quietly. Nicole smiled immediately. Too immediately. "Of course," she said sweetly. "I just think planning ahead prevents confusion." Ryan remained silent through most of those conversations. That was what bothered me most. My son used to have opinions about everything. As a teenager, he argued passionately over curfews, baseball teams, politics, even grocery brands. But sometime after marrying Nicole, he stopped disagreeing with people out loud, especially her. About 6 weeks before Thomas died, I came downstairs late one evening because I could not sleep. The kitchen light was still on. I heard voices before I reached the bottom stair. Nicole and Ryan were standing near the island, counter-speaking in low, tense whispers. "She does not know how any of this works," Nicole said sharply. "Ryan, you need to stop feeling guilty." "I am not feeling guilty," he muttered. "Then start acting like it." I froze halfway down the staircase. Their backs were turned toward me. Nicole crossed her arms tightly, while Ryan rubbed his forehead the same way Thomas used to whenever stress overwhelmed him. "Dad would not want her struggling with that house alone anyway," Ryan said after a moment. "Exactly," Nicole replied quickly. "Once the paperwork is finished, everything changes. We can finally move forward." The words sent a strange chill through me even then. But when the floor creaked softly beneath my foot, they both looked up instantly. Nicole's entire expression transformed within seconds. Her posture softened. Her smile returned. "Evelyn," she said warmly, "I thought you were asleep." I remember standing there in my robe feeling oddly embarrassed, as if I had interrupted something private in my own kitchen. "I just wanted tea," I said quietly. Ryan avoided my eyes while Nicole stepped aside gracefully to let me pass. "We were only discussing some future planning," she explained lightly. Future planning. Another harmless phrase that somehow left a bitter taste in my mouth long after the conversation ended. The following week, Thomas asked me to sit with him on the back porch despite the cold weather. November winds moved through the bare maple trees while he sat wrapped in a wool blanket sipping weak, decaffeinated coffee. He looked smaller than he used to, fragile in a way that frightened me more than any hospital machine ever had. "You know I love you, right?" he asked suddenly without looking at me. I laughed softly because after 38 years of marriage, the question sounded almost absurd. Of course I know that. But Thomas remained quiet. His tired blue eyes stayed fixed on the backyard. The rose bushes had already begun losing petals for winter. "Promise me something," he said after a long silence. Do not let anyone make you feel like you do not belong here. I stared at him carefully then. Thomas, I whispered, what does that mean? He opened his mouth slightly like he wanted to answer. Then the moment passed. Nothing, he murmured quietly. I am just tired. At the time, I convinced myself the conversation came from fear. Dying people say strange things when they are frightened. That was what I told myself anyway. But now, replaying those moments alone in my bedroom after the funeral, I started realizing how often Thomas looked uneasy during those final months. How frequently conversations stopped when I entered rooms. How Nicole always seemed one step ahead whenever finances or legal documents appeared. The worst part was not the suspicion itself. It was understanding that some part of me had noticed these things all along and chosen not to look too closely because I was afraid of what I might find. There are moments from my marriage that still feel warm when I hold them in my memory long enough. Small, ordinary moments that probably meant nothing to anyone else. Thomas standing barefoot in the kitchen at midnight eating cold pie directly from the refrigerator because he thought I was asleep. The way he always warmed up my car during winter before I left for work because he hated the thought of me driving while shivering. The quiet habit he had of touching the small of my back whenever we crossed busy parking lots together. 38 years is long enough for love to become woven into ordinary routines so deeply that you stop noticing them until they disappear. A few days after the reading of the will, I found myself unable to sleep again. The house felt restless around me. Wind rattled softly against the windows while the heating system clicked on and off through the empty hallway. I walked downstairs wearing one of Thomas's old gray cardigans and wandered into the living room without turning on the lights. Moonlight stretched pale across the hardwood floor. For a long moment, I simply stood there staring at his leather armchair beside the fireplace. Nobody had sat in it since he died. Even Nicole seemed to avoid touching that particular chair. I slowly lowered myself onto the sofa across from it and closed my eyes. Suddenly, I could hear his laugh again, low and rough around the edges. After years of black coffee and winter colds, Thomas had never been a dramatic man. He showed love quietly, through consistency, through presence, through all the little things people stop appreciating until grief forces them to replay every detail like old film reels inside their minds. We met in 1978 at a hardware store in Albany. I was 23 and shopping for paint samples because my apartment ceiling had started leaking rusty water stains after a storm. Thomas worked there part-time while finishing accounting school. He spent nearly 40 minutes helping me choose paint colors, even though I later realized he knew absolutely nothing about interior decorating. 2 weeks later, he asked me to dinner at a tiny Italian restaurant where the tablecloths smelled faintly like garlic bread and cigarette smoke. We stayed there until closing, talking about everything from baseball to politics to whether people could actually stay happily married forever. I think most people just stop choosing each other after a while, he told me that night. I do not think love disappears naturally. I think people get lazy with it. At 23, I thought that sounded impossibly wise. At 71, I still think he was right. Our marriage was never perfect. We struggled financially during Ryan's early years. There were nights we argued over mortgage payments while sitting at the same kitchen table Nicole now wanted to redesign. Thomas worked long hours. I worked double shifts at the dental office some years just to keep us afloat. But even during difficult seasons, I never doubted that he saw me as his partner, his equal. That was why Nicole's words inside the attorney's office cut so deeply. Not because I believed them, but because they tried to erase an entire lifetime as if devotion could simply be rewritten by whoever inherited the house. The following afternoon, while Nicole and Ryan attended a lunch meeting downtown, I found myself standing outside Thomas's old workshop in the garage. The room smelled faintly of cedarwood and machine oil. Dust floated lazily through narrow beams of sunlight near the ceiling. His tools remained exactly where he left them, organized, with the same careful precision he used for decades. I ran my fingers slowly across the workbench surface until I noticed something unusual tucked beneath an old stack of invoices near the corner drawer. A small folded piece of paper. My heart tightened unexpectedly as I picked it up. The paper was yellowed slightly at the edges. Thomas's handwriting covered the front in dark blue ink. Evelyn. Just seeing my name written by him again made my chest ache sharply. I unfolded the note carefully. If you are reading this, then I probably waited too long to explain certain things properly. That was all it said. No signature. No explanation. Just one unfinished sentence. I stared at the paper for several seconds, trying to understand what I was holding. Then footsteps sounded suddenly near the driveway outside. I slipped the note quickly into my cardigan pocket just before Nicole entered the garage carrying shopping bags. "Oh," she said lightly when she saw me standing there. "I did not realize you were out here." Her eyes moved briefly across the workshop shelves before settling back on me. Careful, observant. "I was just cleaning," I answered quietly. Nicole smiled politely, but something unreadable flickered behind her expression for half a second. "Ryan and I were discussing renovation estimates during lunch," she said while setting the bags down near the door. "This garage could probably become a really beautiful guest suite someday." Guest suite. I looked around at Thomas's tools. His fishing rods. The faded Yankees calendar still hanging crooked beside the window. Every trace of his life already being mentally converted into resale potential. "Thomas liked it the way it was," I said softly. Nicole tilted her head slightly. "Well," she replied with a small smile, "Thomas is not here anymore." For the first time since the funeral, anger moved through me stronger than grief. Quiet anger. Cold anger. The kind that does not explode immediately because it is still busy turning into clarity. 3 mornings after finding Thomas's note in the garage, I received a phone call just after 7 o'clock. I had been standing at the kitchen sink watching pale winter sunlight settle across the backyard while the coffee brewed beside me. Nicole and Ryan had already left for work. The house felt temporarily peaceful in their absence, though not truly calm. More like the silence that settles over a room after an argument nobody fully finished. I almost ignored the call when I saw an unfamiliar number on the screen. Lately, most calls had been insurance companies, distant relatives, or salespeople who somehow always seemed to know when widows were alone. But something made me answer anyway. "Mrs. Carter," a man's voice asked carefully. "This is Harold Bennett." The name immediately sounded familiar. Thomas's attorney. Not the younger associate from the will reading. The older one. The man who handled our estate planning for nearly 20 years. "Yes," I replied quietly. "Is everything all right?" There was a pause on the line. Papers shuffled faintly in the background. "I was hoping we could speak privately," he said. "Preferably in person." My stomach tightened slightly. "About Thomas?" "Yes." Another pause. Longer this time. "There are certain matters I believe your husband intended for you to understand personally." We agreed to meet that afternoon at a small cafe near downtown Albany. I arrived 15 minutes early out of habit. The December air carried that sharp northeastern cold that settles deep into your lungs the moment you step outside. I wrapped my wool coat tighter around myself while walking past storefronts decorated with Christmas lights and artificial pine garlands. Everything looked painfully cheerful compared to how I felt inside. Harold Bennett was already seated in the corner booth when I entered the cafe. He stood immediately when he saw me. At nearly 80 years old, he moved slower than I remembered, but his eyes remained sharp behind thin, silver-framed glasses. "Evelyn," he said gently while shaking my hand. "Thank you for coming." I sat across from him while waitresses carried steaming plates of pancakes and coffee past our table. Normal people living normal afternoons. I suddenly envied them more than I expected. Harold folded his hands carefully on the table. Thomas visited my office alone several times. During the final month before his passing, he began quietly. I felt my heartbeat slow. "Alone?" He nodded. He became concerned about certain family dynamics. Family dynamics. Such a polite legal phrase for betrayal. I looked down at the untouched coffee between my hands. Did he say what specifically worried him? Harold hesitated. Then he reached slowly into his leather briefcase and removed a sealed manila envelope. My name appeared across the front in Thomas's handwriting. The sight of it made my throat tighten instantly. "Your husband instructed me to give this to you only if circumstances inside the household became difficult after his death," Harold explained carefully. I stared at the envelope without touching it. "What kind of circumstances?" Harold exhaled slowly. Thomas believed there was growing pressure being placed on him regarding financial decisions during his illness, particularly from Nicole. Hearing her name spoken aloud inside that quiet cafe felt strangely validating. Like someone had finally turned on a light in a room I had spent months stumbling through blindly. "He thought she was manipulating Ryan?" I asked softly. Harold chose his next words carefully. "Thomas believed your son was being influenced heavily regarding estate matters and future property control. Outside the cafe window, snow had started falling lightly across the street. Small quiet flakes drifting past holiday decorations and parked cars. Everything looked soft and peaceful while my marriage continued unraveling itself piece by piece even after death. Why did he not tell me directly? I whispered. Harold's expression softened with visible sadness. Because he was afraid. I looked up sharply. Thomas was not afraid of Nicole. No, Harold replied gently. He was afraid of what confronting the situation might do to your family. That sounded exactly like my husband. Thomas spent his entire life trying to preserve peace, even when peace no longer deserved protecting. Harold pushed the envelope slowly across the table toward me. There is more, he said quietly. Several amendments were drafted shortly before his passing. They were intentionally structured, separately from the primary will. I frowned slightly. Separate how? Protective provisions, he explained. Legal safeguards involving residency rights, estate disbursements, and conditional inheritance clauses. My pulse quickened. Conditional? Harold nodded slowly. Thomas wanted certain measures in place if you were ever pressured, mistreated, or forced from the property after his death. I could barely process the words. For several seconds, all I heard was the soft clatter of dishes behind the counter and Christmas music playing quietly overhead. Then one memory suddenly surfaced, so clearly it made my chest ache. Thomas sitting beside me on the porch wrapped in that wool blanket saying, "Do not let anyone make you feel like you do not belong here." He knew. Somehow, even while dying, he knew exactly what was coming. There is one more thing you need to understand, Harold said carefully. Nicole is unaware these additional protections exist. I finally picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. The paper felt heavier than it should have. Neither is Ryan, he added quietly. I stared at Thomas's handwriting for a long moment before speaking again. What happens if they discover it? Harold's expression became unreadable behind his glasses. That, he said softly, depends entirely on how far they are willing to go. After meeting Harold Bennett, I stopped reacting emotionally in front of Ryan and Nicole. That was the first real change. Grief still lived inside me, heavy and exhausting, but something colder had started growing beside it. Awareness. I began noticing details the way people notice storm clouds after hearing a tornado warning on the radio. Quiet things. Careful things. The following morning, I came downstairs earlier than usual and found Nicole standing alone in the dining room photographing furniture with her phone. She startled slightly when she noticed me near the staircase. "Good morning," she said quickly, locking her screen. "Morning," I replied calmly. Her eyes searched my face for a moment as if trying to determine whether I had seen enough to become suspicious. Then she smiled lightly. "I was just showing a friend how beautiful. The house is. Beautiful. That word again. Nobody ever talked about the memories inside the house anymore. Only its appearance, its value, its future potential." I poured myself coffee slowly while Nicole continued tapping messages into her phone. A few seconds later, her screen lit briefly against the marble countertop. I only caught part of the message before she turned it over. "If Evelyn agrees to downsize by spring." Downsize. Such a polite word for disappearing someone. I stirred cream into my coffee without saying anything. Nicole glanced up again. "Ryan and I were thinking maybe we should host Christmas here this year," she said casually. "It could be nice for the family." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. Thomas had not even been buried 2 weeks before they started discussing holiday hosting arrangements like newly crowned homeowners. "Thomas always loved Christmas Eve dinners," I replied quietly. Nicole smiled thinly. "Traditions change." Later that afternoon, I went into the garage workshop again after they left for dinner with friends. Snow pressed softly against the windows while cold air carried the faint smell of cedar and machine oil through the room. I pulled Thomas's unfinished note from my cardigan pocket and read the sentence again. "If you are reading this, then I probably waited too long to explain certain things properly." I stared at the handwriting for several moments before finally opening the bottom drawer beneath his workbench. It stuck slightly from years of old wood swelling during humid summers. Inside were scattered receipts, measuring tapes, loose batteries, and an old Yankees baseball cap Thomas wore every autumn while trimming hedges. Beneath the cap sat a small brass key taped carefully underneath the drawer lining. My pulse quickened immediately. Thomas had always hidden spare keys in strange places. Once, during a camping trip in Vermont, he hid our cabin key inside an empty coffee Can because he claimed nobody ever steals decaf. I picked up the brass key slowly. Small, heavy, old-fashioned. I knew exactly what it belonged to before I even stood up. The safe behind the bookshelf in our bedroom closet. Thomas installed it nearly 20 years earlier after a burglary happened 3 streets over. Very few people knew it existed. Apparently, Thomas wanted to keep it that way. I waited until after midnight before going upstairs. Ryan and Nicole's bedroom door remained closed at the opposite end of the hallway. Soft television sounds leaked faintly beneath it while I quietly stepped into my closet and slid several winter coats aside behind the built-in shelves. The safe sat exactly where I remembered, hidden behind old storage boxes and garment bags. My hands trembled slightly as I inserted the brass key into the lock. The door opened with a soft metallic click. Inside sat several folders, a velvet jewelry case, stacks of sealed documents, and one small digital recorder. I froze when I saw it. My breathing slowed instantly. Thomas used to carry that recorder everywhere during his final months because medication sometimes made him forget conversations with doctors. Beneath it sat another envelope with my name written carefully across the front. I opened it slowly. Evelyn, if you found this, then things are probably unfolding exactly the way I feared they would. I sat down heavily on the closet floor as snow tapped gently against the bedroom windows behind me. The letter continued in Thomas's uneven handwriting. I should have protected you sooner. I thought I had more time. Ryan is not a bad man, but he has become weak where Nicole is concerned. She pushes quietly, constantly. Sometimes I see it clearly. Other times I convince myself I am imagining it because I want peace inside this family before I die. Tears blurred my vision briefly, but I kept reading. There are documents here Harold understands. Trust him, and trust yourself. Most importantly, do not let anyone pressure you into leaving this house. Not for guilt, not for convenience, not for family harmony. This home belongs to you as much as it ever belonged to me. I pressed the letter tightly against my chest for several seconds. Then another line near the bottom stopped me cold. If Nicole ever realizes what I changed in the estate documents, she will panic. The hallway floor creaked suddenly outside the bedroom. My heart jumped violently. I looked toward the door just as footsteps paused briefly beyond it. Silence followed. Then Nicole's voice floated softly through the hallway. Evelyn. I quickly slid the recorder and documents back into the safe while trying to steady my breathing. Yes. Are you awake? She asked sweetly through the door. Sweetly. Always sweetly when she could not see what I was thinking. I could not sleep. I answered. A pause. Then softly. Neither could I. Her footsteps lingered outside my bedroom for several seconds longer before finally disappearing down the hallway. The next morning, I behaved exactly the same as always. That was important. I made coffee at 6:15. I opened the kitchen curtains, overlooking the backyard. I fed the birds near the patio, even though winter had already driven most of them south. Nicole watched me carefully over breakfast while pretending not to. I could feel it in the small pauses between her movements. The way she glanced up whenever I touched my phone. The way her smile lingered half a second too long whenever she asked harmless questions. Did you sleep all right? She asked while spreading avocado onto toast. Eventually, I replied calmly. Ryan sat beside her scrolling through emails on his tablet. He looked exhausted lately. Dark circles beneath his eyes. Constant tension across his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, I found myself wondering whether guilt was finally beginning to catch up with him. I might stop by the cemetery later, I said quietly while pouring coffee into my mug. Ryan looked up immediately. Alone? He asked. The question surprised me. I have been alone for quite a while now, I answered softly. He looked away again after that. Nicole reached across the counter and squeezed his wrist gently. Such a small gesture. Controlling disguised as comforting. After they left for work, I returned upstairs and locked my bedroom door before removing the digital recorder from the safe. My hands trembled slightly as I pressed the play button. Static crackled softly for several seconds. Then Thomas's voice filled the room. Weak, tired, but unmistakably his. If you are hearing this, Evelyn, then I was. Right to worry. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. Outside the windows, snow drifted quietly across the front lawn while Christmas decorations blinked faintly along neighboring houses. Ordinary suburban winter life, continuing while my dead husband spoke to me from a recorder hidden inside a safe. I did not know how to explain this to you without creating more pain during my final months. Thomas continued. You already carried enough. His breathing sounded uneven between sentences. I closed my eyes briefly, just hearing it again. Nicole started involving herself in financial matters shortly after my diagnosis worsened. At first, I believed she was only trying to help Ryan prepare for the future. But over time, certain conversations became troubling. The recorder crackled softly again, then silence for several seconds before Thomas resumed speaking. I overheard her discussing the house with a real estate agent before I was even gone. She thought I was asleep in the den. My chest tightened sharply. Somehow hearing confirmation hurt more than suspicion ever had. Ryan does not fully understand what is happening, Thomas said quietly. He thinks he is protecting his future. Nicole keeps convincing him that practicality matters more than sentiment. I stared at the snow outside while grief moved through me differently now. Less like drowning, more like awakening beneath freezing water. But a home is not only lumber and square footage, Thomas whispered weakly through the speaker. A home remembers the people who loved inside it. Tears blurred my vision briefly. I wiped them away quickly because somehow crying felt less necessary now than listening. If Nicole pressures you to leave, understand something clearly. That pressure is intentional. Harold helped me create protection specifically because I feared this exact situation. Papers rustled faintly near the recorder microphone. There are conditional clauses attached to Ryan's inheritance. If either he or Nicole attempt to remove you from the property, manipulate residency access, or financially coerce you after my death, portions of the estate automatically transfer elsewhere. I sat perfectly still. My heartbeat echoed loudly inside the quiet bedroom. Including the house, Thomas added softly. For several seconds, I could not breathe properly. Nicole had spent weeks behaving like ownership already belonged entirely to her and Ryan. Renovation plans, real estate conversations, furniture changes, all while completely unaware that every cruel little push brought them closer to losing everything. Thomas coughed painfully on the recording before continuing. I wanted to believe they would still choose kindness after I was gone, he admitted quietly. Maybe that was foolish. No, I thought silently. Not foolish. Hopeful. Thomas always believed people could become better if given enough love. Even at the very end. Most importantly, Evelyn, he whispered weakly, do not surrender this house out of guilt. You built this life with me. Every room in this place carries your fingerprints too. The recording ended abruptly after that. Just silence. I sat there for a long time staring at the recorder in my hands while winter light slowly shifted across the bedroom walls. Then something unexpected happened. For the first time since Thomas died, I no longer felt powerless inside my own home. That afternoon, Nicole returned from shopping carrying glossy kitchen renovation brochures tucked beneath her arm. I thought we could start updating the downstairs sometime after New Year's, she said brightly while spreading catalogs across the dining table. Marble countertops, open shelving, modern lighting fixtures. She spoke with easy confidence while Ryan nodded distractedly beside her. I looked down at the photographs silently. Then at the woman sitting across from me planning renovations for a house she did not legally control the way she imagined. What do you think? Nicole asked sweetly. I folded my hands carefully in my lap. I think, I said softly, people should be very careful before making plans inside someone else's home. Nicole's smile flickered almost invisibly for the first time since Thomas died. 2 days later, Harold Bennett called again. This time his voice sounded more formal, more resolved. Evelyn, he said carefully, I believe it is time to schedule a secondary estate review. I stood near the living room window holding the phone while icy rain slid slowly down the glass outside. A review? I repeated quietly. The additional trust provisions need to be formally acknowledged, he explained. Legally, there are documents that require witness confirmation from all involved parties. All involved parties. I understood immediately what that meant. Ryan and Nicole would need to sit in that room and hear the truth Thomas left behind. When? I asked softly. Tomorrow afternoon. After we ended the call, I remained standing there for several moments staring out at the wet gray street while Christmas lights blinked faintly along neighboring porches. The house behind me felt tense already somehow, as if it sensed what was coming. Nicole returned home around 5 carrying shopping bags and smelling faintly of expensive perfume and winter air. You seem quiet today, she observed while hanging her coat near the entryway. Just tired, I replied calmly. Ryan arrived shortly afterward looking distracted and drained from work. During dinner, Nicole talked almost non-stop about holiday plans, new furniture stores, and possible kitchen contractors. She sounded happy, relaxed, like someone already settling comfortably into ownership. "I found the perfect marble countertops this afternoon," she said brightly while scrolling through photos on her phone. "The current kitchen feels so outdated." I took a slow sip of water before answering. "Thomas designed that kitchen himself." Nicole smiled politely without looking up. "Exactly." Ryan shifted uncomfortably beside her, but said nothing. Again, always silence. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was afraid anymore. Because I finally understood what Thomas had been carrying alone during those final months. He knew his family was slowly dividing around him while his body failed. He knew Nicole saw the house differently than we did. To her, it was property, opportunity, status. But to Thomas and me, it was 38 years of ordinary love pressed quietly into walls and floorboards and holiday photographs. The next afternoon, we arrived at Harold Bennett's office. Just before 3 o'clock. The same conference room. The same polished oak table. But this time something inside me felt entirely different. Nicole entered confidently, wearing a tailored cream coat and gold earrings that caught the overhead lighting whenever she moved. Ryan followed beside her carrying his phone and coffee cup. Both of them looked mildly irritated more than concerned. Nicole glanced toward Harold immediately. "I am still confused why another meeting was necessary," she said lightly while taking her seat. "I thought the estate matters were already finalized." Harold folded his hands carefully atop several organized folders. "Additional documents were pending review," he replied calmly. Nicole smiled thinly. "Well, hopefully this will not take too long." I noticed Harold watching her closely over the rim of his glasses, quietly evaluating. The room settled into silence as everyone sat down. Rain tapped softly against the windows behind us. Finally, Harold opened the top folder. Before his passing, Thomas Carter established several conditional estate amendments attached to the original trust. Ryan frowned immediately. "Conditional?" Harold nodded once. "These provisions were intentionally withheld until after the primary will reading." Nicole crossed her arms slowly. "Withheld from whom?" "From all beneficiaries." Something sharp flickered across her expression then. Not fear yet, but caution. Harold continued reading calmly. "Under Amendment Section 4, the Willow Creek property remains permanently protected residentially for Evelyn Carter unless voluntarily relinquished solely by her." Nicole let out a short breath of irritation. "We already know she can stay in the house." "There is more," Harold replied evenly. The room became very still after that. "If any beneficiary attempts through coercion, intimidation, financial pressure, manipulation, or residential interference to remove Evelyn Carter from the property against her wishes, all inheritance allocations attached to the estate trust immediately become void." Silence crashed across the room so heavily I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock behind us. Ryan stared upward slowly. "Void," he repeated. Harold nodded calmly. "In that event, all protected assets transfer instead to designated charitable foundations outlined by Thomas Carter prior to his death." Nicole's face lost color almost instantly. "That is ridiculous," she snapped sharply. "What exactly qualifies as pressure?" Harold adjusted his glasses carefully. "The legal definitions are extremely detailed." He opened another folder, including documented conversations, housing discussions, intimidation attempts, renovation coercion, financial leverage, and emotional harassment. Nicole sat frozen beside Ryan now, completely still. For the first time since Thomas died, she looked genuinely uncertain. Ryan turned slowly toward me. "Mom," he said quietly, "did you know about this?" I met my son's eyes calmly across the table. "Your father wanted me protected." Nicole laughed suddenly, but there was no warmth left in the sound anymore. "Protected?" she repeated bitterly. "From family." Harold's voice remained steady. Thomas appeared deeply concerned about potential mistreatment following his passing. Nicole's composure cracked visibly then. "That is absurd," she snapped. "We moved into that house to help." Harold looked directly at her. "Then these provisions should never become relevant." Ryan rubbed both hands slowly across his face while staring down at the table. Exhausted, cornered, finally beginning to understand the full weight of what his father anticipated before dying. I reached into my purse carefully and removed Thomas's handwritten note. Then I placed it gently atop the conference table between us. Thomas knew exactly who loved him, I said softly. My eyes shifted slowly toward Nicole, and who only loved what he owned. The drive home from Harold Bennett's office felt strangely quiet. Not tense anymore. Just finished. Rain moved steadily across the windshield while Ryan drove, without speaking, and Nicole stared out the passenger window with both arms folded tightly across her chest. Nobody turned on the radio. Nobody pretended things were normal. Some truths are too large to survive small talk afterward. When we pulled into the driveway, Christmas lights still glowed softly along the porch railings Thomas installed years ago. He always insisted on hanging them himself no matter how cold December became. It does not feel like Christmas until the lights go up, he used to say every winter while untangling cords in the garage with frozen fingers and terrible patience. I sat in the parked car for several extra seconds staring at those lights while grief settled over me one final time. Not sharp this time. Not drowning. Just deep and tired. Ryan finally cleared his throat beside me. "Mom," he said quietly. I waited. He looked older suddenly. Smaller somehow. I did not know Dad changed everything like that. I studied my son carefully in the dim gray afternoon light. Part of me wanted to ask how much he truly did not know. Another part no longer needed the answer. "Your father was trying to protect what mattered to him," I said softly. Ryan lowered his eyes immediately. Nicole opened her door without speaking and walked toward the house ahead of us. Her heels clicked sharply against the wet driveway. Fast, controlled, angry. Inside, she disappeared upstairs almost immediately. 30 minutes later, I heard drawers opening and closing above my bedroom ceiling. Suitcases rolling across hardwood floors. Closet doors shutting harder than necessary. Ryan stood silently in the kitchen during most of it, staring down into a mug of untouched coffee that had already gone cold. "She thinks Dad trapped us," he said eventually. I folded a dish towel carefully beside the sink before answering. "No," I replied quietly. "Your father gave everyone a choice." Ryan rubbed his forehead slowly. The same exhausted gesture Thomas used during difficult years when bills piled too high or life became heavier than expected. "I should have paid attention sooner," he admitted softly. There was at last. Not a defense. Not an excuse. Just truth arriving too late to undo damage. Upstairs, another drawer slammed shut. Ryan flinched slightly at the sound. "Nicole wants us to move out for a while," he said after a moment. I nodded once. "That may be best." He looked surprised by how calmly I said it. Maybe he expected anger. Maybe punishment. But grief changes. Your understanding of conflict. By 71, I no longer needed dramatic victories. Peace mattered more. "Mom," Ryan whispered carefully. "Are you angry with me?" I thought about the question for a long moment while snow began falling softly outside the kitchen windows again. I think," I said slowly, "you stopped seeing me as a person after your father got sick." His face tightened immediately. "That is not fair." "No," I replied quietly. "It is not." Silence settled heavily between us after that. Around 7 o'clock, Nicole came downstairs wearing a long camel-colored coat with her suitcase standing beside the front door. Her makeup remained perfect, her posture straight. Only her eyes revealed how furious she still was beneath the surface. "Ryan," she said sharply, "we should go." He hesitated beside the kitchen counter. For one brief second, I saw the little boy who used to run crying into my arms after neighborhood baseball games when he struck out in front of his friends. Lost, torn between comfort and pride. But adulthood hardens hesitation into decisions eventually. Ryan picked up his overnight bag slowly. Nicole reached for the front door without looking at me. Then she paused. "You know," she said coldly, "none of this changes the fact that Thomas left everything complicated because he could never let go of the past." I met her eyes calmly across the foyer. "No," I answered softly. "He left everything complicated because he finally saw the future clearly." Nicole stared at me for several seconds before walking out into the falling snow. Ryan lingered behind after the front door closed. "I am sorry," he whispered finally. "Real regret this time." Quiet and exhausted. I nodded once because there was nothing else left to say tonight. Then he followed his wife outside. I stood alone in the foyer listening as their car disappeared slowly down the street. The house became still afterward, truly still for the first time in months. I walked slowly through the living room, turning off lamps one by one until only the Christmas lights remained glowing softly near the windows. Then I stopped beside Thomas's leather armchair and rested my hand gently against the worn fabric. You were right, I whispered into the quiet room. Outside, snow covered the backyard roses Thomas planted for me 30 years earlier. In spring, they would bloom again whether anyone deserved them or not. I finally understood something grief had been trying to teach me all along. Love is not proven by who stays near you when life is easy. It is proven by who still protects your dignity after they are gone. And in the end, Thomas did exactly that.